In 1961, an ordinary man sat down in a chair. He was a teacher, a father, someone who described himself as a gentle person. 45 minutes later, he had pressed a button he believed was sending 450 volts of electricity into another human being. He was crying, shaking, begging the researcher to let him stop. The researcher said 4 words: "Please continue the experiment." He continued. He was not the exception. He was the 65%. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why, and why the same thing could happen to you. Let's go back to where this started. Not 1961, 1945. The Nuremberg trials. Nazi officers on trial for some of the worst atrocities in human history kept giving the same defense over and over. I was just following orders. The world found this explanation almost insulting. Surely ordinary people don't become monsters just because someone in a uniform told them to. Surely there's something different, something broken in men who could do that. A young psychologist named Stanley Milgram wasn't so sure. His hypothesis was darker. What if the defense wasn't a lie? What if obedience to authority was powerful enough to override conscience in almost anyone? Not just Nazi officers, but regular people in a regular room on a regular afternoon. He designed an experiment to find out, and he built it to be deceptively simple. Here's exactly how it worked. A participant arrives at a Yale laboratory. A researcher in a gray lab coat greets them, calm, professional, holding a clipboard. Another participant is also there, friendly, ordinary. What the real participant doesn't know is that this second person is an actor, part of the experiment. They draw slips of paper to assign roles. It's rigged. The real participant always becomes the teacher. The actor always becomes the learner. The learner is led into an adjoining room and visibly, convincingly, strapped into a chair wired to electrodes. The teacher sits in front of the shock generator. 30 switches, 15 volts apart. For every wrong answer, increase the shock by 1 level. The learner is never actually shocked, but the teacher doesn't know that. What the teacher hears is a recording, carefully designed. At 75 volts, a grunt. At 120, complaints of pain. At 150, the learner demands to be let out, says his heart is bothering him. At 180, he screams he can't stand it. At 300, he pounds on the wall and stops answering entirely. Here's the detail almost nobody remembers about this experiment. At several points, the teacher hesitates, turns to the researcher, asks if they should stop. The researcher has exactly 4 scripted responses. Nothing more. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. That's it. No threats, no punishment. Just 4 calm sentences, repeated as needed, from a man in a lab coat. Before running the real experiment, Milgram did something almost as interesting as the experiment itself. He asked 40 psychiatrists to predict the results. Their consensus, virtually no one would go past 300 volts. Maybe 1 in 1,000, some kind of sadist, would go all the way to the end. The actual result wasn't 1 in 1,000. It was 650 in 1,000. 65% delivered the maximum shock, 450 volts, 3 times, even after the learner had gone completely silent, which the instructions explicitly said should be treated as a wrong answer, requiring the next shock. Every single participant went at least as far as 300 volts, the point of pounding on the wall and total silence. The psychiatrists weren't just wrong. They were wrong by a factor of 650. Now here's where most retellings of this experiment stop, and it's exactly where the real story begins. Milgram didn't run this once. He ran it 19 times, 19 variations, each changing 1 detail, to find out exactly which conditions made obedience rise or fall. The patterns he found are the part that should actually keep you up at night. In one variation, the researcher gave orders by phone instead of being in the room. Obedience dropped to 20%. Physical presence of authority mattered enormously. In another, the teacher didn't flip the switches themselves, they just read the word pairs, while someone else administered the shocks. Obedience rose to 90%. Read that again. 90% of people will go along with something they find morally horrifying, as long as someone else's hand is on the switch. In a third variation, Milgram moved the teacher into the same room as the learner, close enough to see his face, his distress, his body. Obedience dropped to 40%. And in the most extreme version, the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate for the punishment to register. Obedience collapsed to 30%. Distance was doing almost all the work. The further obedience traveled from its consequence, across a wall, through a phone line, through someone else's hands, the easier it became. Here's the 50% moment. The part of this story that changes everything you think you understand about it. Milgram's experiment is usually remembered as a story about evil, about cruelty, about what's wrong with people. But that's not what the data actually shows. In post-experiment interviews, the vast majority of participants who delivered the maximum shock were in visible distress. Sweating, trembling, some laughed nervously, a documented stress response, not amusement. Many begged the researcher to check on the learner. One participant had what was described as a full seizure during the session and had to be removed. These weren't people who didn't care. These were people who cared enormously and obeyed anyway. Milgram's actual conclusion wasn't people are evil. It was something much stranger. Ordinary people can do extraordinarily cruel things while feeling extraordinarily bad about it the entire time, as long as someone else appears to be holding responsibility. He called this the agentic state, the moment a person stops seeing themselves as the author of their actions and starts seeing themselves as the instrument of someone else's will. Once that shift happens, the question stops being, is this right? And becomes, am I doing what I'm told correctly? One more variation matters here because it answers the question you might already be asking. Was this just a thing that happened to men? In 1961, in a room full of other men, Milgram ran the experiment with female participants too. The obedience rate was 65%, identical to the men. Whatever this mechanism is, it isn't about gender. It isn't about the 1960s. It isn't about a specific kind of person. For decades, critics argued the results couldn't hold up today. The 1960s were different. People were more deferential. A modern audience, more skeptical, more individualistic, would surely behave differently. In 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger ran a partial replication at Santa Clara University with modern ethical limits on the maximum voltage. The obedience rate was virtually identical to Milgram's original findings from nearly 50 years earlier. In 2010, a French television documentary recreated the experiment as a fake game show with a live studio audience and a host. Contestants believed they were applying real electric shocks to another contestant for a TV prize. 81% delivered the maximum shock. 81% in 2010, on camera, for a game show. The man in the lab coat had simply been replaced by a TV host with a microphone. So why does this happen? What's actually going on underneath? Humans evolved in small groups where hierarchy and cooperation were survival mechanisms. Deferring to group leaders, especially in unfamiliar, high-stakes, or ambiguous situations, wasn't a flaw. It was often the difference between the group surviving and not. Your brain is wired to treat confident authority figures in unfamiliar institutional settings as a shortcut. This is probably fine, because someone who knows more than me is in charge. A laboratory, a man in a white coat, a clipboard, calm, repeated instructions. These are exactly the signals that ancient part of your brain reads as legitimate authority. Proceed, the shock generator, the screaming, your own racing heart. Those signals were competing against it. In 65% of people, the authority signal won. This isn't a story about bad people in 1961. It's a story about a switch that exists in every human brain, yours included, and exactly which conditions flip it. So what do you actually do with this the next time you're the one in the chair? Researchers who studied the 35% who refused found they almost always did the same specific thing out loud before they stopped. They made the authority restate the instruction in their own words, not continue, but specifically, you are telling me to keep shocking him even though he stopped responding, and you are taking full responsibility for that. Most authority figures asked to say it that plainly hesitate. Some can't say it at all. That's the move, not silent refusal, not internal doubt, forcing the responsibility to be spoken out loud by the person actually holding it. It sounds small. It isn't. It's the one action that consistently broke the spell in Milgram's own data. In our next video, we're going to look at what happens when that same switch gets flipped, not in a laboratory with strangers, but inside a group of people who already know each other, real students. a real building, and 6 days that had to be stopped early. Turns out, you are far more interesting than you think.